Hey everyone, Grant from Hamina Wireless here. In today's video, it's going to be a bit of a longer one where we are going to walk through the different elements for Hamina Network Planner, Hamina On-Site and Hamina Live. You might want to use this maybe if you want to evaluate Hamina. You may want to use this if you're a pre-existing customer and maybe there's some feature or function within the tool that you'd like to understand a little bit better. And I'm going to do my best to cover as many of the facets within the tool as I possibly can. So just to start with, Hamina Network Planner does run in a web browser. You can see, I'm on Mac OS, but I'm using Google Chrome. It really doesn't matter what web browser you're using, as long as it's a modern web browser. So think, Google Chrome, Safari, Firefox, even Microsoft Edge, it'll work fine. You can see that I'm on the US instance here, and I'm at the Create New Project option. Now, there's a couple of things that I'm going to do here. So first is this will be a university. So I might just call this Test University. The country I'm going to set to Australia. That's where I'm based. Now, when you set the country, that will refine the regulatory domain for what channels you've got available to you. You can always change this later on. So for instance, in 5 gigahertz in Australia, we've only got 21 available channels. Within 6 gigahertz, we've only got Uni 5, so we've only got 24 channels. So, if I set this to the US, I would have way more channels available on 6 gigahertz, and I would have a few more channels available on 5 gigahertz. So just keep that in mind. For the environment type, I'm just setting this to university because I'm going to show you a university with a multi-story Wi-Fi design here. We'll come back to this in a little bit. Depending on the environment, we will have some of the AI functions that are built into Hamina that will make your life a little bit easier. And then you've also got project foldering. And so, whether you want to actually include the project within a folder or maybe a subfolder, you can totally do that as well. So for instance, you may want to split your folders up based on maybe a customer type, maybe an environment type, maybe, by state or maybe by country, if you've got a globally distributed team that is using Hamina. Just to get going, I'm going to save that. To get started, drag and drop a floor plan. I can enter some project notes, but what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to drag and drop a floor plan in. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to open this floor plan up and just to show you what we're going to bring in. Now, this is a PDF floor plan. Hamina does support many different image file formats, JPEG, PNG, CAD files as well. And you can sort of see that this is a 4-page PDF document, okay? Now, we'll just close that down and I will drag and drop that into Hamina. Now, what Hamina is going to do is it's going to do a little bit of processing here. And you can sort of see if I click on the map drop down here, it just sort of processes each of the maps individually. And what it also does is it does split each of the pages out into its own individual map, which is really, really handy. Now, for this particular design, I already know that I don't need 3 HQ building plan. And the reason is because this building is actually built onto a slope. I don't really need this because this is sort of cross-sectional and it's got some outdoor environment. So what I'm going to do, just to make things easier up front, I'm going to delete this floor plan. So that's super easy. I can go in here and I can just hit delete. You can see I've got a couple of other options here. We will get back to them in a little bit. Now, the thing what I might do is I might start on the top floor here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to rename this to 3. So now everything should be 1, 2, 3. Nice and easy, nice and straightforward. And if I go to the 3rd level here, my floor plan's sort of ready to go. And you can see that there's some things that are happening within Hamina flashing up on the screen. And so I'm going to go through and explain those in a little bit. The first things I'm going to do though is I'm going to just sort of explain the ability to, zoom in. So I can mouse scroll in, mouse scroll out, right? I can pan around the map by clicking down on my scroll wheel. So mouse 3. And I can move that around as well. If at any point I want to reset the orientation of the map, I've got this little zoom to fit option here, so that sort of snaps it back out, which is nice and handy. I do also have manual zoom options here and zoom out options as well. You can see down the bottom here, I've got this option to switch to trackpad mode or, vice versa, I can switch to mouse mode. Now that's really because you can use Hamina either with a mouse or, if you, like me and you're traveling and you don't bring a mouse with you, you can then use the trackpad. So just be sure you can sort of change this. You can sort of see if I change it to trackpad mode, the mouse scroll just scrolls the map up and down. If I switch that back over, I can zoom in, zoom out, nice and easy. One other tip that I would sort of also option is if you find that maybe the buttons in Hamina are looking pretty small, or the text or anything like that, so you can go into your browser options and then you do have the ability to zoom in, and you'll see that like the buttons on the side of Hamina and the text will get much bigger. Conversely, if we zoom it back out, I don't need glasses just yet, so it looks pretty good to me. But you know, in case you do want to sort of increase the font size and things like that, you can totally do that. That is super easy to do. Okay, now before we get into the design thing, the other thing that you do have is you've got the ability to, you know, you can see here we can rename the entire floor plan. We looked at that before. I can click on the floor plan again. I've got the option to adjust the floor plan, and so I can go in here. I could adjust the opacity if I want, right? So, you know, this can be really good if you sort of want to maybe fade some parts of the floor plan out, maybe make the heat mapping, which we'll get to later, a little bit more vibrant, but I'm going to keep that at 100%. You can also rotate the map as well. Now, you know, this is probably pretty handy if you're finding that, you know, the maps are a little bit off kilter, or maybe you've got like a, you know, some sort of a multi-story facility and the floor plan isn't quite perfect. You can use the rotate function to sort of better line them up as well. And then you've also got the ability to remove colors, and you'll see here, like, you know, this floor plan is pretty grayscale. It's pretty much black and white. There is some color, you know, down on the bottom right here. However, I do have the option to crop. And so if I want to, I can just sort of move that slider over, and you'll see I can now check that box. And that area is now, I'll give it a second to think about it. There we go. And now that area is nice and cropped and out of the way. So, you know, there's a couple of different options there. You can do some, you know, floor plan adjusting or manipulation within the product, you know, without having to do it beforehand, which is nice and handy. Okay, now historically with, you know, with Wi-Fi design tools, you would need to scale the image. You would want to scope the image, you know, meaning, you know, where do I want my infrastructure? Where do I not want any infrastructure? Maybe indoors versus outdoors, for example. And then I would also, you know, then start drawing in my walls and things like that. Now, all three of those functions, they are AI functions within Hamina, and so they are on by default. You do have the ability at any point to override them. And so you can see down the bottom right-hand corner here, I've got a little robot head with a 10 meter, with an approximation here, sort of basically saying that like, hey, Hamina thinks that this floor plan and this distance is approximately 10 meters. Now, if that looks pretty good, you can just continue along on your day. However, you do have the option, you know, on the left-hand panel here to select the scale. You could zoom in and you could sort of say like, hey, I actually know, for instance, that, I don't know, maybe the distance, you know, from this wall here to this wall here is actually, you know, maybe it's 20 meters, right? So you could actually override that and say, no, I actually think that that's 20 meters. That looks pretty good to me. You'll see that now the little robot head has disappeared and the scale is now not a wiggly line, it is a firm line. So that means that the user has actually provided the scaling for us. So, you know, it's always good just to verify that. The nice thing about this is that we do not need the image that's imported into Hamina to be a CAD file or a PDF. It doesn't need, it can be just a flat image file, which is great. And, you know, the user's got the ability to override that at any time. It also means that you don't need an actual scale on the floor plan to do this. So Hamina's AI takes a bunch of different data points and it makes, you know, an educated calculation on what it thinks the scale is. So, you know, if you have a floor plan without a scale, don't worry about it. You can still import it into Hamina. You will still get the same experience that I just showed you then. Now, the next step is we've got the scoping. And so you can sort of see here, like there's this little sort of magic pixie dust, whatever you want to call it, with the scope zone. And so, you know, I can click on the scope zone here and you can sort of see like Hamina has actually run the scoping around the perimeter of the building. And it's really intricate. Like it's sort of done the cut-ins as well, which is great. If you are manually doing this, this is probably going to take you a good 20 minutes to do. Hamina's AI has already done it. It's done a pretty good job. And so you can accept that. In the case where you may want to adjust the attenuating area for whatever reason, you can always select it. So for instance, here you can sort of see the gray shading. So if I select the scope zone now and I want to make an edit to it, what I can do is I can click and you'll see I've now created like a little pivot bubble. right? And I can click on Hamina and do another one, and maybe I click to create 4 little points here. And then what I can do is I can click and drag, and you'll see how Hamina just sort of snaps to the point. And now I've created that. So, if I really want to make sure that I've got my scope done correctly, which might be important because, I definitely don't want to place access points in this, this outdoor area here, particularly if it's a building, they're just going to fall to the ground. Then I've got that option to adjust after the fact as well, which is really handy. The last option that we've got here is the walls. And so you can sort of see here, again, Hamina, the pixie dust, the magic sprinkles, and you can sort of see here, we've got the option where on the right-hand side, we've got AI wall detection is in place. I do have another option here for CAD or PDF layers. And so, if you do have a vectorized image and it's got that layer information in there, you can opt to use that instead. However, in my experience and what I'm going to focus on today is I do find that the AI wall detection is so incredibly good that it's probably the best place to start with. And I mentioned a good place to start with because you can do a little bit of wall manipulation and editing after the fact as well, and I'll show you that in a little bit. With the AI wall detection, we are currently, as of today, detecting walls, doors, and elevators. And you can see here, if I hit the drop down, it gives me a list of other, out of the box wall defaults that Hamina comes with. So, for instance, if I don't want it to be heavy drywall, I could change it just to standard drywall, and Hamina will do that, but it will do that for all of the walls that it thinks are within the plan. Same with the doors. I could change that to like a glass door or a metal door. To be honest, heavy drywall, wooden doors, elevator shafts, those are all pretty good, out of the box defaults to start with, and you could further refine your design model after you've, hit the auto draw walls option. So let's hit that now, and you can see Hamina will apply that, and we're pretty much done. Now, from here, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to switch to 3D mode. So you can sort of see up here, I've got a 2D option, I've got a 3D option, right? And so the 3D option is really good to help me understand visually what's been implemented within the design. It can also be useful for, visually understanding your environment, particularly when you get into more complex areas such as, raised or elevated environments, stairwells, things like that, atriums, etc., etc. It can also be really good for if you're doing some more complex AP deployments with differing heights with access points, where the access point pin on the map size will increase or decrease depending on the height, and you'll be able to visually see, what height the AP is at based on the 3D view. So it can be really good to just sort of help visually verify, does this look correct to me? Yep, okay, great. We can switch back to 2D view and be on our merry way. Now, at this point here, while we're in this sort of top section, we should probably just have a quick look at maybe at least one of the other buttons here. And this is basically your visual filter. And so this will increase or decrease in size depending on what is actually on the map at the moment. So you can sort of see here, if I didn't want to show the walls, I can just uncheck that, and you can sort of see now the walls are now disappeared. They're not visible. They will still attenuate. So if I placed an AP, it would still attenuate like it normally would, but I just can't visually see them. So it's, can be handy. Okay. Now, once the AI walls have been traced in, you do have the option to make some further edits to your design. So you can do some sort of manual overrides, so to speak. So for instance, if we zoom in down the bottom here, you can sort of see that, there's definitely some areas here that would be like windows or something like that. And so, let's just make the assumption that this section here is a window. You can sort of see when we look at it, again in 3D view, it's just like a brick wall or something like that. In fact, we should probably just change this to a brick wall. If I click left to right, the blue box needs to encompass the entire part of the wall segment if I want to edit it. If I do it the other way around, if I go right to left, you'll see the blue box just needs to cover any portion of the wall segment, and then it will be editable. So you can sort of see here, I can now change that entire section, that 3 wall section, into brick. If I sort of go down here and demonstrate the other way, I click left to right, you'll see that I need to move the cursor the entire way across before I can edit and change that. And you can sort of see there very visually, especially if I switch to 3D view and zoom out, I've got these 2 segments that are now brick. Now, further to that, if for whatever reason I wanted to maybe sort of, add some windows in here, maybe, make it look a little bit more realistic, I do have out of the box a couple of window options. Now, these are, exterior facing windows, so I might make them tinted, so I can select that. And now I don't have to delete this wall segment out. All I need to do is I just click. So I'm going to left click, and then I right click to finish. I'll do the same over here. I've left click, right click, and now I'm done. I'll zoom out a bit, switch to 3D view again to validate, and you'll see that I've got like one large, big window here, and then I've got, whoa, that was a little bit too quick. And then I've got a slimmer, smaller window over there. And you'll see that Hamina understands the user intent. So when we're doing, the window drawing, it's not trying to stack a window on top of the wall. Hamina understands that, oh, you would like to put a window in here. Well, that's okay. You're basically inserting a window. So you don't have to delete a wall segment. You don't have to tell Hamina that you want, a window in the middle and you want some brick infill at the top and the bottom. Hamina can do that automatically. And the way that it does that is, if you just have a quick look into here, you can sort of see it will fill top and bottom. And so, depending on the wall segments that are next to the window, it will automatically fill those in with, the corresponding material, which in this case is brick, which is quite nice. Now, if you wanted to, you could go around and, you could change all of the exterior buildings. The other way to do it would be you can just select the walls, if you wanted to change the exterior, and then, you can see that the Hamina cursor just sort of snaps to the pre-existing wall. You could just click and you can just sort of trace over it if you really wanted to. So maybe not if it's a complex wall like this with, these crevices and things like that. But if it was just like a straight wall or something like that, it would probably be much easier just to go click, click, done. And you can see there I left click to start, left click to finish the wall, and then I right click to stop drawing the wall altogether. If I wanted to make say like a customized brick, like maybe in Australia, we've got strong, tough bricks and, it's got, heavier attenuation or something like that, I could just sort of go in here. And then my preference is I pick something that is already existing out of the box from Hamina, and I just duplicate that. And so, just call this strong Aussie brick. And yeah, it's got 10 dB attenuation. And you'll see there, we just put the attenuation for 5 gigahertz. And so, Hamina basically works out what the attenuation would be for the 2.4 and the 6 gigahertz as well. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out the knowledge base article that does explain how we work that out from, a white paper that is publicly available. Probably the only other thing that you can do just to sort of think about is you do have the ability to have top height from the floor or bottom height from the floor. So, that's particularly useful for if you want it just to be a door. So, you want the door to be, 2 meters high, then you're going to want to, put 2 meters in there. So it's not going to go from the floor right through to the ceiling. And then conversely, bottom height from the floor would be the material didn't touch the floor at all. And so you can also apply both as well to have like a floating object, so to speak, as well, like a window. The other thing that I quite like is transparent in 3D, where if you do click that, you can actually visually see through it, which can be helpful if you are doing some 3D bits and pieces, fill top and bottom, again for the windows, and then whether you want to change the color or not. So, I could make the color, maybe like a darker. And you can sort of see there, I've got this strong Aussie brick sort of down the bottom there. Now, the only other thing that I'll just mention with the walls, and this is the same with the attenuating objects, same with creating them and changing them and doing all that sort of stuff, is we do have hotkeys as well. So you'll see here for brick, it is B. So for instance, if I'm drawing an Aussie brick like this, and then I hit the B key, you'll see it now, the color grade changes, right? And so maybe I just want it now to be concrete. I can hit C. You'll see that Hamina selects it. So it's got that, blue highlight there. And then I can create or draw now concrete as well. So just keep in mind, you can give your custom materials a shortcut key, but you cannot use a pre-existing shortcut key. Hamina will flash red and it will get angry at you if you try to use the same shortcut key on multiple materials. But it does make things a little bit easier, if you're doing some manual drawing. Now, We are on the top floor here, so there's a couple of things that we probably want to do. The first is we've got this void here, and so the void is that, below us we've got like an outdoor courtyard, and this being the top floor, we probably want to create that void for Hamina, because otherwise it's just going to think that this is a concrete slab. So what we can do is we can go into here, and you can see we've got this floor holes. I can click and drag that as a big box, and you'll see now that is, cut hole in the current floor, or I can cut away from the outside of the building edge. So we definitely don't want to do that. We are just cutting away from the current floor. That looks pretty good to me. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm also going to create a scope zone here. And what that means is that I'm going to click and drag again, and I'm going to exclude the void. I do not want to see what the Wi-Fi looks like in that void, because it's 5 meters in the air. No one can access that. I'm going to be worried more about what's happening on the floor below in the outdoor courtyard. And so now that is done. And now comes time to place our APs. So, pretty straightforward. We've got an access point option here. I can choose my access point, or I can choose my auto planner. Now, for me, being a network engineer, I would much prefer to manually place my APs. So I'm not going to go through the auto planner. Just know that with the auto planner, it does only work with omnidirectionals. If you want an auto planner for directionals, we think that requires a little bit more finesse, particularly because the mount type, height, the orientation, down tilt of the antenna, that is all, pretty touchy stuff that a network engineer should be, paying a little bit more attention to. So if you want to auto plan, it's just for omnis. My preference, because Hamina generates the heat mapping so quickly, I just prefer to go through and manually plan things. Okay, so in the AP list here, we've got a series of vendors, and you can sort of see, like, I'm not going to spend any time on any one vendor. There is a whole bunch of different vendors in there. So what I'm going to do, and I can also use a keyboard to search for this, like I could just type in Juniper, and maybe like 47. And there's a couple of different options here. So you can sort of see I've got this Omni AP47, and I can look at the antenna pattern in 3D. I can look at, the 2.4 or the 6 gigahertz or the built-in Zigbee radio if I want. Then I've also got another variant here, directional, right, which we've got here. And you can sort of see the horizontal, vertical, or elevation azimuth. And then I've also got an external antenna model, so we might use that for something a little bit later on. But if we go with the 47 here, you can see it's got different modes. So I've got like a tri-band mode, I've got a dual 5 and a 6 mode, or I've got a 656 mode as well. So if there is this option from the vendor, you will find in Hamina you've got a drop down for the different modes there, which is nice and handy. I can change the mount type if I want, but we do use the default. The height, this is an Omni AP, it is going to be mounted to the ceiling. And then here I've got my AP name, what I want my default transmit powers to be. If it's got an ultra wideband radio in there, we'll have this option there as well. And then I've got what switch it's connected to. Then, that could be a switch, an IDF and MDF, depending on what you want to do. And then you've also got the power allocation. So we do also map the PoE power draw as well. Now, we'll move through this pretty quickly, and I'm not going to change too many of the defaults, but let's just, we'll just start planning our AP or our network here. And so you can sort of see here, this is not intended to be like the ultimate perfect Wi-Fi design, although, I would prefer to put APs in the meeting rooms. I think that that's probably a good idea, because, that usually there's going to be a bit of a cluster. Now we've got female and male toilets here. I'm not a big fan of putting an AP in there. Maybe we'll put one in the corridor here, and another meeting room. We'll put another one down here. And there we go. Okay. Like I said, that's not meant to be perfect. Maybe we'll place another one just outside the elevators and the reception room here. And we'll just shift this guy up a little bit. There we go, done. Now, a couple of things just happened in Hamina. One, it was very, very, very quick. But two, the channel planning all happened all at once. If I have a look here, I've got channel planning option up the top. I do also have a shortcut to the channel planning if I have an AP selected. Either option is going to get me into my channel planning. And if you recall at the start of the video, I did set my regulatory domain to Australia. So, pretty common, 1611. I can switch to 1, 5, 9, and 13 if I would like to. I do also have the option here to disable unnecessary interfering 2.4 gigahertz radios. And then I've got a couple of other options here. And, the one that I quite like is switch unnecessary 2.4 gigahertz radios to 5 gig when possible. So, definitely when we've got the AP models, like from a vendor such as Juniper, we could have checked that box. Hamina would automatically change that for us, which is great. 5 gigahertz. Now I'm sort of cheating a little bit here, or not cheating, but I'm being a little bit naughty. We've only got 21 channels in Australia on 5 gig. I really shouldn't have 80 megahertz checked. I also really shouldn't have 40 megahertz checked, but I do because it does give you a little toast message in Hamina down the bottom of the screen when you are placing multiple APs, when it does drop the channel width down. And so Hamina will basically start at 80 megahertz. That's what this little allowed channel widths option means. And then it will drop down to 40 if there's a bit of channel interference. It will then drop down to 20 as well. You can allow for a certain amount of interference, for instance, like if you've got like hidden node type issues, or, maybe it's a super dense environment where you just, you would rather the APs to be at least a little bit audible to each other and you're willing to accept a little bit of channel interference, then you can bring this slider up or down depending on what you want to do. And then you've also got the ability to, outright disable certain channels that you do not want to use or see available. So for instance, you've got like the Uni 2 channels here, they are often, affected by like DFS events. So, maybe if you're deploying near an airport, we want to disable some of those as an example. And then we've got 6 gigahertz. So, again, I'm being a little bit naughty. I really shouldn't have 80 megahertz checked. I would probably start at 40 megahertz and then drop down from there because I've only got 24 channels available in Australia, which you can see represented here. Now, if at any point you want to manually assign your channels, you can uncheck auto channel assignment, you can select the AP, and you can, manually set those channels. And so you can sort of see here, if I click on channel 108, I've got the option here, I can switch off auto and then I can change it to whatever I want. But that's a pretty painstaking process. I'm going to let Hamina do that. Now, this isn't to say that Hamina is going to force your AP vendor to use these channels, but it is really good to understand, will my network be able to operate, let's say, at 80 or 40 or 20 megahertz channels with my current infrastructure? We are only designing for our infrastructure. We're not contemplating what else is happening out there. So rogue devices, third-party networks, things like that. But it does give us a good indication of what sort of a channel plan will work within our environment. The other thing to keep in mind with the AP is you've basically got these little bubbles underneath. Bubble to the furthest left is going to be your 2.4 radio. You've got your middle radio being 5 gig, and then your third radio, your one on the right, is your 6 gigahertz radio. So I can just tell visually at a glance the 2.4 gigahertz radio is off in this meeting room area. So this might be a good way for me to actually change this to a, let's go with a dual 5 and a 6. And so you can sort of see there, Hamina automatically recalculated that. So it does flash up red because it does detect a bit of CCI, and then it's changed some things around here, and away we go. So, really nice. I've now got a dual 5 and a 6 gigahertz radio option in that meeting room, which is probably going to be much better than just having a dual band AP in there effectively with a 2.4 radio entirely disabled. So a much more effective use there. Now, there's a couple of options that we've got from here. We could go and we could do the wall tracing, the scoping, the AP planning for the other levels as well. But let's finish with this level here. And so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to place a switch, IDF or MDF. Okay, now if I click on that, I've got a couple of options here. I could just go with a simple switch with some ports and a power budget. I could go with something a little bit more complex, like with an MDF with, different stacks and, how many switches have we got, how many ports per switch, what is the power budget. I can also go with an IDF as well, depending on what I'm looking to do. I'm going to keep things nice and simple. I'm going to just stick with a switch. And then what I'm going to do is I'll just zoom in here. This looks like a mech closet. I'm going to place my switch within the environment here. And then you can sort of see I can click on the switch here. And then it already tells me, or Hamina tells me, like, hey, you've already got 19 ports that are going to be required. That's based on the number of APs that I've got on the map. If you ever need to do a quick calculation of how many APs have I got, you do also have the option here. You've got a little 19 bubble. And actually, while we're at it, if I just do a Command A or Control A, at any point I can select all, and you'll see that it does select all the objects on the map. And then I can maybe select the walls, network devices, or in my case, I could select the APs, and I might decide that, like, hey, you know what? I need to change vendor. Maybe I need to change AP model. It's a very quick and easy way to select all objects within the environment. You can sort of see here, now that it's selected all of the APs, it's saying, okay, you've got vendor as Juniper, but I've actually got two different models here. I've got two AP47 models, but one is a dual 5 and a 6. And then I've also got the different mounting options here and also the different colors. So, it can also help the filtering where maybe you want to make some access points a different color to make it visual that they have, maybe a different mount height, maybe a different mounting bracket, maybe a different antenna, maybe it is a different vendor, for example. And so it does make it very visually easy to sort of to find things and to change things and things like that as well. All right, so back to the switch. Click on the switch here. I'm going to at least need this to be 24 ports. Power budget, 551 watts at a minimum. Now, if I just said, look, this is a 500 watt switch, maybe it's going through an upgrade cycle. Hamina straight away says, like, hey, you've got insufficient power. That's no good. So, I need to fix that pretty quickly. So, let's just give it a 650 watt budget. Now, everything looks pretty good. Hamina is happy. I can click on power and cabling details here. I get a list of all of my APs, what floor they're on, make, model, power, and then also cable length. So, you can sort of see here, these purple lines are the cables that are automatically, terminating at the switch. Now, if you've, ever done, structured cable runs or anything like that, you'll know that, this cabling is not super realistic. So with Planner Plus, you do have the option for cable trays. So with the cable trays, what we can do is we can increase the magnet distance here. And we're going to do a very, very simple cable tray just to illustrate what it's going to do. But what it'll do is you can see that sort of that magnet distance is what we call it, is it snaps all of the cables that are within that distance to the tray itself. And you can sort of see there that now all of the APs, they run a cable down to the tray and then up to the switch itself. And so, again, if we click on the switch and we click on the power and cabling details, you can see all of those cable lengths are in there and they will all be updated because they'll be traveling to the cable tray as well. And, if you want, you can even have a look here. We do include some, additional percentages for the lengths. So you've got a little bit more on the loom. And, in the event that you need to maybe move an AP, shift it around, like, we can't because, there's something in the way or there's something that's going to obstruct it, you can shift the AP around. You've got that capability. And all of this will get pulled through into the report eventually as well, which is really, really nice. Now, the other thing that we could do is we could give this switch a name. So we could just call this Southwest. So you can sort of see here, switch 1, Southwest. Okay, cool. Now what we could do is we could Control A, we could select all of our access points, and then here you can see we've got it, it's just called access point with a number. Okay, that's great. What I can do is I can click on this little question mark here, and I've got a couple of variables that I can add, right? So what I could do is I could maybe copy, paste that, but I'm going to change this now to switch. And so now all of the AP names are now called access point 18, switch 1, Southwest. So we now know where the AP is meant to be terminating at. And so, again, if we go into our switch itself, you'll see that the AP name is now a little bit cleaner on that option. And so what we might do is we can then also clean up the map here We can just call this level 3. So that looks pretty good. So now if we go back in, you can see access point 1, switch 1 south, blah, blah, blah. Level 3 is what it's connected to. And so, you can put a bunch of different modifiers in here. You can do it to the switch. You can also do it to the AP. So, it can get very complex, but it can also help, particularly with multi-story facilities where where an AP is meant to terminate at, particularly if it is going to terminate at a switch on a different floor, for example. You can go into the access point here and you can see that they will, connect to the nearest device, but you can, if you've got multiple switches, select multiple, specific switch rather, and you can have it, connect to the switch in the basement level or something like that. Or if we can't get, a cable out to it, we could always mesh it and then, just power it instead. So you do have that option in Hamina as well. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch off the heat map for a second. There's a couple of other things that we're going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our capacity planning. Now, we have the ability to draw capacity zones, and you can have zones and then you can have subzones. So you might want to have maybe sort of like general Wi-Fi coverage, and then in maybe some more dense environments you might want to have like higher capacity Wi-Fi or something like that. So you can absolutely do that. For this case, I'm just going to draw a big blue box over the entire area, and you'll see a couple of things straight away. So first thing is, the APs will now get, and their radio bubbles will get another bubble underneath. And those bubbles indicate capacity, so what clients are actually associated to those radios. We can see down the bottom here, we've got 10 2.4 radios, 25 gigahertz radios, 19 6 gigahertz radios, and we haven't done anything in private cellular. Client-wise, this is what the distribution looks like. And then I've also got my limits here. So what is my acceptable limit of clients per radio? And so, you can click on the little box here and you can open that up. So you can change this depending on what you would willingly accept for your environment. So for instance, if this was, say, a stadium, we are definitely not going to accept maybe, this amount of capacity. Maybe you would, but that's up to we leave that up to the user. The other nice thing that you've got here is you've got this 6 gigahertz capable clients. And so this is a bit of a slider. And so, as of today, 30%, yeah, possibly. At least, in Australia, 20% or thereabouts, give or take a couple of percent, is about the rate of 6 gigahertz capable clients. So the reason that we've got this as a slider is because, in most cases, 6 gigahertz clients will try and associate to the 6 gigahertz radio. And so, if you slide this further up, you will actually find that Hamina's capacity planner will shift more clients to those 6 gigahertz radios, which can then help sort of, provide some relief for the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz radios that are really starting to get very, very congested. So, you can play around with this slider depending on what you're looking to do for your environment. And then the other thing that we've got is we've got the capacity zone itself. So we can give the zone a name. We can also add devices to it. And so those device types, we've got different cellular and Wi-Fi devices, but they are pretty common devices that you would find out there. And so, for instance, if this customer is using a lot of, say, Android phones versus, Apple devices, we could say, let's put in 1,000 and see what happens. We could put in 1,000 Android phones, and you can sort of see from here straight away, like, I don't even need to move my viewport. I don't need to zoom out. I can already tell, just because I've clicked on the radios tab here, that 8 out of the 25 gigahertz radios are oversubscribed. They are over their limits. And if we have a look here, you can see that we only are allowing 40 clients per 5 gigahertz radio. So keeping that in mind, so we've got 8 that are, that are no good. What happens if we move the slider up to 50%? We can minimize that again. And now we've only got 3 radios out of the 20 that are over capacity. So maybe, as time goes on, the network is going to be able to better cope because there's going to be a lot more 6 gigahertz radios within the environment, as an example. Now that I've zoomed back out, you can see very visually within Hamina the red indicating that these 3 radios are basically oversubscribed. Now we're using internally an algorithm of what the capacity looks like, and this capacity zone is just a very big box over an entire floor plan. in reality, doing your own design, you're probably going to have smaller capacity zones and things like that. But as a generalization, that gives you a pretty good indication that, like, hey, if we did have 1,000 Android phones, 50 MacBooks, 50 iPhones, we probably need a few extra radios, just in case, which is basically what's being suggested here. Okay, now the last thing that we're going to look at before we move on to the rest of the building design is the client view or the client experience. And so, we've got down the bottom here, we can click on our little client person, and we can click and place him into the environment. And you can sort of see here on the right hand side, I can change the client type, so, again, the same devices that we had in the capacity planning. I've also got cellular and ultra wideband devices in there as well. I can choose whether it's a 6 gigahertz capable client, whether it's a Wi-Fi 7 capable client. I've also got a couple of other options here. So I click that little, drop down. I can change things like the client height, what the simulated noise floor would be per band, what the client transmit power is, the minimum interfering RSSI if we want to sort of change things, which, might be handy for like warehousing or industrial, or, depending on if we're using custom devices, you could get this pretty close. And then you've also got whether you want it to be, what is the link direction? Do we want it to be downlink? Do we want it to be uplink? Or do we want Hamina to just use worst link, which is either, which one is going to be the worst? And, the worst link is in the Planner Plus tier as well. So if we do make our client, and let's say it is an iPhone, if we do make him 6 gigahertz capable, you can sort of see here he's still on 5 gig. We probably need to move him a little bit. And if we do have him roam, you'll see now he's roamed. He is now on 6 gigahertz, which is, okay, that's great. And then if we do make him Wi-Fi 7 capable, he is now using 802.11be. If we switch off the Wi-Fi 7 capability, he's just on AX, which is the standard for Wi-Fi 6E. But if we do make him Wi-Fi 7, he will use the BE standard. And, you can sort of see, some of the, I guess, under the hood, MCS rate, spatial streams, and what his channel width is likely going to be. The other thing to keep in mind is you've got the radio capacity here as well. Now the radio capacity does tie into the capacity planner. So if we move our little roaming man all the way down here to where the radio is totally oversubscribed, you can sort of see here like the radio capacity is at 84%. Now if we go back to our capacity plan here, and let's say we just drop this down to 100 Android phones, right? And then we go back to our client view. We go back in. He's still associated, but radio capacity is now at 16%. So it's much, much better. And so even though, sure, I'm getting neg 53, and even though theoretically I could get 516 megabits per second, if the radio capacity is at like 90% or 80% or whatever it is, really that throughput is just not going to be realistic. So just to give you a bit of an idea there. But what we've found a lot of customers quite like with this is, you can use this to sort of simulate like, okay, what happens if I do have an iPhone and I roam him through my environment? You can sort of see here, as he does start to roam, signal gets a little bit worse, then it gets better as he roams, things like that, which is great. You can also do this in 3D, which I think is really neat and really cool. So yeah, my little roaming man walking through the environment. He's walking really fast. So he's on a mission. Great. And then it can also be used as a bit of an educational tool for stakeholders. The stakeholders aren't necessarily always going to be tech savvy or anything like that. They may not understand, like, why do I need X amount of access points more than my previous generation? Well, our workflows have changed. We're using augmented reality and VR technologies, and we're requiring higher bandwidth and higher client densities. And so the roaming man can also help understand that, like, hey, if we did remove a certain subset of APs, look at the roaming experience. It's going to be pretty poor. You can do that for a multitude of different verticals, especially when you've got things like client height, things that are changeable like the noise floor and things like that. Okay, now with all the fun we've been having, we are doing a multi-story building. So what we've done so far is we've pretty much done the design for a single floor. Now, for the multi-floor, we do want, and I'll just show you an example. If we go down to the second floor here, again, Hamina will analyze the scale. It will automatically scope the environment. It will also automatically draw in all of the walls. We've actually removed the scope there, but you can see it's already applied. So we just need to accept that. But what you'll notice is that, well, this is the floor below. Like, where's all the AP? Where's all the signal propagation? It's just not there. Because we haven't aligned the floors within Hamina, Hamina's got no context. It doesn't understand that, that there are APs on the floor above. So we need to give it that context. And so to do that, what we need to do is we just go into here and we've got the align floors option. So what we can do is we click on that. Now we can just move our APs into position here, like so. And this is where, I actually find it works really well. I can rename the floor plans all in one viewport, which is great. So level 1, 2, and 3. I can define the attenuation, so the attenuation of the slab. Also, what is the ceiling height as well. So if you're dealing with multiple heights, you can adjust those as well. So just keep in mind, if you put an access point, above the 2.5 meters on level 1, it is going to be basically in level 2's slab. So that will cause some problems. Now to align the floors, we just use this single viewport, and you can sort of see here that the currently selected floor plan here, which is level 2, has got the little black dot. And then I've got this orange overlay, which is changeable depending on what other levels are in my building. And you can sort of see there, it just gives me this orange overlay, which I can, shift and move around. I can rescale these if I want by clicking and dragging the little edge box here. I can rotate the map by clicking on this little center icon here as well. I'm not going to do too much of that, but just to give you an idea. So that will adjust the scale. But otherwise, all I do is I just, click and I just move the map above the stairwell like so. Do the same on level 1. We'll shift that up to here like that. Looks pretty good. And then we're done. And now what you'll see is I've got these little icons on the map now. These are little AP icons, and the arrow pointing up means I have APs on the floor above. So we've already got the scale for level 2. That's great. We've already accepted the scope, and then we're going to accept the auto drawing walls. Now what happens if we turn on the heat map? We are going to see the signal propagate from the floor above. So let's do that now. We'll click on Wi-Fi and you'll see, there we go. Now, one thing that stands out really obviously is the courtyard section. We've got a lot of signal propagation down there, and that's because, if you recall, we drew the void area on the floor above, which meant that ignore the slab here, let any signal propagate down, and we can see that represented here as well, which is really handy. Other than that, we would go through the same design process. We would go through and we could define the switching and things like that as well. Do the same for level 1. About the only other thing that you may want to consider with the multi-story, multi-level buildings and things like that, you do have wide client capabilities. So, if you wanted to deploy things like cameras, card readers, computers, desk phones, basically anything that could be a third-party wireless device, or it could be a PoE-powered Ethernet device, you can deploy that within Hamina, within the environment as well. It will route a cable to your switch IDF MDF, and it will also consume a port. It will also consume a PoE power budget. So, if you're doing structured cabling, if you're doing more than just the AP, you can do the AP, the cabling, the switching, and then also any other third-party devices like cameras, environmental sensors, etc. So, Hamina's doing the whole thing, which is great. But the other thing that you may want to consider for multi-level is cable risers. And so, if you've got certain areas within the building where the cables will pass through the floor or pass through the slab at specific sections, you can define that within Hamina as well, and the cables will route through that section. And so the cable risers is a part of the Planner Plus tier